So let's go ahead and get started. If you'd everybody grab a seat, and we're going to get this class underway. Good morning. So good to see a bunch of disciples eager early in the morning. Got your coffee going already, and we're excited. My name's Tim Summerlin, and I'm in the Denver church here. And I'm really excited to teach this class along with my friend Rachel. I'm going to have her introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I am a counselor in the Denver area. I'm in the Denver City Singles, so single ministry. I went to University of Colorado Boulder and Denver Seminary, have my master's in counseling, and I work in private practice and also with the criminal population, teaching psychoeducational classes to offenders.
All right, good morning. Now, this is really great this morning. Rachel's teaching alongside me with this class, and this is very special for us. Rachel was my daughter's roommate back in college, and she actually, both my kids live in China, and Rachel talks to them every single week. She's a super loyal friend. She keeps them connected to the United States a little bit. So I'm very excited to hear from her today. But before we start, we got to do a selfie, right? Right, so ready? You guys ready? On three, ready? One. Wait a minute, got to get my... Two. Three, yay. Yay, all right. So I want to thank you guys for choosing this class today. And what we want to hope to do in the next hour, we've got a lot of material to cover, is we want to help you add to your toolbox skills and heart to help not only yourself, but to help other people. I think by now most of us understand that baptism, when we become disciples, baptism changes our hearts. It gives us a new relationship with God, and it begins us on a lifelong journey. But we also understand that all of us come to God as broken people in need of change. That is, we're always looking to become more and more like Jesus. Now, that's not our salvation, is it? Becoming more like Jesus is not our salvation. Our salvation is called justification. That's what happened on the cross. But as we grow older and mature, we want to become more like Jesus. So we're going to teach you today what I believe are some very effective counseling skills. Now, you might say, hey, I'm not a counselor. First correction, yes, you are. You know, it's only in the Western world that we think of counseling as a professional-only occupation. But let me correct that. Matter of fact, you're going to find the word counsel in the Bible 46 different times in the scriptures. You never see the word discipler, by the way. It's words like counselor. And in Isaiah, before Jesus was even born, what did they call Jesus? A mighty counselor, right? So if we're going to be disciples of Jesus, we're to be counselors, to be just like him, correct? So yeah, that mighty counselor, that's not just something we want to put on a Christmas card. So as friends and mentors, advisors, consultants, teachers, and disciplers, we all counsel. Let's look at the master counselor today, Jesus, and his amazing and creative heart to heal, and the skill that he has, that he demonstrates as a counselor. I want to let you know, first of all, my orientation, where I come from. So I've got a doctorate degree in counseling, and I read a lot of books and all that stuff. But here's where I come from. Here's my orientation. 3 years ago, my wife and I, Jackie, started a ministry called the In Motion Ministry. And it's a ministry in the Denver church where we help anybody with any problems. And what we bank on, here's what we go for first and foremost, is that we put Jesus right smack dab in the center of our ministry. We don't do concepts. Well, I guess we do concepts, but only when we find them in the man Jesus. We believe he's the originator. He's the perfection of any effective counseling concept. We, first and foremost, we preach the gospel message. We believe there's great power in the Word of God and in what Jesus did on the cross to change our lives. We don't just go with any old psychological fad or philosophy or book, but we always put Jesus at the very center of any change that goes on. So that's where we're coming from. And I hope that encourages you. Because we can all do that. We can all go to the scriptures and we find Jesus. There's a great psalm. Write this one down. Psalm 119, verse 96. It's encouraging to me. We're not going to turn there. And I do appreciate the come on Tims. That'll just get me going. It's really cool. In Psalm 119, he says, he says, to all perfection I see a limit. In other words, every theory, everything out there, the writer says there's a limit. But he says, you know what? Your commands are boundless. There's no bound. When you get in the scriptures, there's no limit to the amount of change that can go on. So that's what we're banking on. And y'all know the Apostle Paul, right? When he went into Corinth, so Paul was a brilliant man. He went into a church that was very troubled. And instead of relying on all of his smartness, which he had a lot of smartness going, here's what he said. He says, I resolve to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And then when you read that letter of 1 Corinthians, he kept going back to that over and over. Every single problem that came up in that church, that's where he landed. So as we work with each other and as we work on ourselves, we keep that at the foundation of what we do. Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now here's the challenge, is how do we incorporate that effectively into other people's lives? That's what today's about. And again, we're going to look at the master. Jesus Christ was a master counselor. But I want to ask you guys a question as we dive into this. In one word, what were you like as a 12-year-old? In one word. Troubled. Oh, why? A why child? Manipulative. A 12-year-old. Wow. Rebellious. Ooh, yes, in the back. Insecure. Yeah, I see that all the time. What else? Other words? Yes. Emotional. Ornery? Mischievous. Yeah. So 12-year-olds are really starting to pick it up, aren't they? Let's look at another 12-year-old. Look in your Bibles at Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. By the way, thank you for all your honesty. And for those of you that didn't say anything, thank you for your thoughts. Luke chapter 2, look over in verse 43. And let's listen carefully to the boy Jesus, the 12-year-old. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. The only time my parents ever got astonished at me was not a good thing, right? But here's a guy who's 12 years old, and it says people were amazed at two things. They were amazed at his listening and his asking questions. And that's what we're going to bank on today. That's where we're heading today. We want to talk about Jesus' amazing ability to listen and his astonishing questions that he asked. It's like Luke couldn't find the right words. He looked around at these people that were responding, and all he could come up with, amazed and astonishing. Jesus was the master counselor. Today, what we're going to do is discuss our helping relationships and those two important features. You know, there's many important features of a friendship. Hanging out, having a purpose together, just hanging out and getting together, being there during tough times. But there's nothing more important in a relationship than our ability to listen and to ask really good questions. Jesus listens. I lead a grief group in the Denver church occasionally, about once or twice a year. And one of the exercises in our grief group is you get together with a partner and you share your life for 30 minutes. And your partner's not allowed to say a word. They're not allowed to. They just have to sit there and look at you and shake their head. They're allowed to cry or laugh. But you get to talk for 30 seconds. People tell me, they say, Tim, I've never had that before. I've never had anybody sit and listen to me for 30 minutes. It was amazing. As a society, we don't do well with listening. Sometimes we don't care enough to listen. And let's take a look at a video that maybe it'll grab your attention about listening.
I'm actually kind of quiet off stage. A lot of people don't realize that. I was at a dinner party recently. A bunch of people that I don't know. One guy talking plenty for everybody. Myself rather than I, and then myself, and me. I couldn't tell this one about I, but myself, and then me. Where are the me monster? So I tried to jump in with a little story. I don't want to just sit there the whole night. Right when I'm done with my story, this guy goes, that ain't nothing. Didn't mean to waste everybody's time. Telling my nothing story. Here, let Marco Polo speak. He's back with tales of adventure. The story ain't nothing. Maybe it wasn't, because I made the mistake of trying to tell a story about having only 2 wisdom teeth pulled, and I learned a lesson. Don't ever try to tell a 2 wisdom tooth story, because you ain't going to know it. The 4 wisdom teeth people are going to parachute in and kill out with your 2 wisdom tooth tail. You will never complete one, trust me. I'm trying to tell my story. You know, I had some wisdom teeth pulled. I had 4 pulled. No 5, no 9. I had 9 wisdom teeth pulled. All 9 were impacted. They were all coming upside down. The roots were up on my tongue, coming up my nose. They were tough. That was a warthog. No anesthesia. They pulled him out with pliers. I was eating corn on the cob that afternoon. And a blue ribbon upon his chest. That knocks the socks off of my wisdom teeth. Why do people need to top other people? I've never understood it, and I see it all the time. Obviously, people get something out of it. At best, people wait for your lips to stop. You leave. You see that? Now I do. What is it about the human condition? People get something out of that. That's why I have a social fantasy. I wish I was one of the 12 astronauts who have been on our moon. They must love knowing they can be anybody's story. Whenever they want. They can sit back quietly at a dinner party while some other person, some me monster's doing his thing, and let him go. Let him run with the line while you be quiet. Let him have his moment. Yeah, I'm a big traveler. I have my business all. I got my global enterprise. I got to check. You know, I'm driving the Autobahn because I keep a fleet of sports cars from Zurich, and I get this Swiss account that I want to check. Not pulling drugs, but I might have to cancel that. You know, runways are nice, but I'm sure the first time you go in there, the Pacific Rim Company are going to try to take that over. It's a global enterprise. I walked on the moon.
I don't know about you, but that's kind of convicting to me. You know, we have to train ourselves to be good listeners, don't we? You guys remember Peter up on the Mount of Transfiguration? He's up there with a pretty impressive crowd, right? He's got Jesus, he's got Elijah, he's got Moses up there, James and John. And what's Peter say? Hey, it's good to be here. Let's build a shelter or something. And here's what God goes. He goes, it says, while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my son whom I love and I'm well pleased with. Listen to him. God tells us that when we listen, we're on holy ground. Peter is getting ready to miss something very important because he didn't go up there to listen. You know, we're not called to have all the answers. We're not called to push our theological opinions off on other people, or to be the smartest guy in the room, or to position ourselves in some hierarchy. But we are called to listen. What have you missed by not listening? Learning to listen is my first thought today. For several years, this was my only New Year's resolution. Tim, listen. That's all I had for like 3 or 4 years. Then I thought, okay, I'm growing in that a little bit. Let me expand. Look in your Bibles at Matthew chapter 13. And let's see how many times we find the word hear or listen. Matthew chapter 13, verse 13, right up on the screen here. This is why I speak to them in parables, Jesus says. Though seeing they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is filled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I'd heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. 10 times in one verse, we see the word hear and listen. As a matter of fact, in the Bible, 771 times, you find the word hear and listen. The connection is this. When we listen, we can hear and understand. People are always saying, hey, I want to understand. You have to hear first. We've got to listen. Listen well in order to understand. When Jesus wanted to communicate, he needed to stop for a moment and clarify the need for listening. The difference between active and passive listening is what goes on inside the head and the heart of the listener. I'll restate that. When we're listening, true listening is what goes on inside your heart and your head. Not just the person you're trying to help. Matter of fact, there's 2 hearts on display. The person you're trying to help and your heart. My heart's on display when I listen. Let's hear a couple of points about being a great listener. Number 1, humility. James 1:19 says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, how did James know that? James grew up in a home where his big brother was Jesus. Obviously, Jesus listened to his little brother James. What a guy. Any of you guys have big brothers who ever listened to you? Nope, not my big brothers. Then he watched Jesus with Peter and the rest of the crew. And he saw Jesus listen with his heart. Think about having a heart with ears. It's a good metaphor. To be a good listener, have a heart with ears on it. You know, I'm not the most important guy in the room when I'm listening. One of my favorite theorists, her name is Insoo Kim Berg. And she has this thing called not knowing. When she counsels people, she doesn't know where to go until she listens. I got in a big argument with a professor once. He goes, no, that's just a technique she does. I said, I don't think so. I think it's who she is. She doesn't know, so she listens to find out. The opposite of being a humble listener is being a distracted listener. Eyes are darting. You're not tuned in. Maybe you're thinking about somebody else to go talk to. Listening with engagement takes great humility. Let's be humble listeners. Secondly, though, we listen seeking to understand. Proverbs 18 verse 13 says to answer before listening, that's folly and shame. What's important is not my experiences right now. What is important is what my friend is trying to share with me. At times we feel like we always have to relate to people, just like the video. We feel this over sense of, I got to relate, I got to prove that I'm on the same page as you. I think relating is sometimes overemphasized. You know, about a year and a half ago, I got in a big argument with my adult son. We call him Tim. And we were having this big argument, and I was trying to prove to him how great our family is, and you shouldn't be talking bad about our family, Tim. And he goes, Dad, you don't know what it's like to grow up in a conservative Christian family. I said, you're right. I said, but you don't know what it's like to grow up in a dysfunctional Methodist one. He goes, you're right. But it reminded me, I've got to sit and listen to his perspective. So I calmed down and I said, Tim, tell me about growing up in a conservative Christian family. What was that like? And we had a great talk. But I had to seek to understand him. Thirdly, listening is a search for clues. Think about that. When you listen, it's a search for clues. If we listen well, we can pick up on how to help people. You all know who Paul Simon is? Anybody know Paul Simon? Raise your hand. Oh, good. Thank you. So Paul Simon is one of the top songwriters of the last 100 years. He's an amazing songwriter. And I was watching a documentary on him one night. He was talking about this album called Graceland. It was probably his best work he ever did. And I was starting to get a little bit lost because he was really getting into music, which I don't know anything about. But I thought, I'm going to really pay attention. And he got to a part of the discussion where he said, in America, music's very predictable. The standards, it goes this way, it goes this way. It's very predictable how it works. But in Africa, where he was living at the time, he said it was unpredictable. He goes, I couldn't figure it out. And I was getting ready to turn off the TV because I couldn't figure it out either. And then he said something that arrested me. He said, I began to listen, and listening became my education. And that's what I did. I went, oh. I ran upstairs, got a pen, write that thing down. Here's an expert in music. But he stumbled. He couldn't figure something out. He said, I learned to listen, and that listening became my education. Let's listen with a search for clues. Fourthly, patience. It takes great patience to be a listener because we got to build rapport. We got to build that ability to connect to people. It takes a while sometimes. People got to know, hey, this guy I trust him or her. I'm with you. You can convey that sense very quickly that I'm here to serve you. But it takes patience. Let's be careful not to hijack conversations. That video did a really good job with it. We want to match. We want to throw our 2 cents in. It's okay to swallow that for a while. You'll get your chance, right? There'll be somebody else that'll listen to you. But when you get the sense somebody says, I need someone to listen. Just park it in the back of your brain for a while and say, I'm here to be available for you. Be patient. And then finally, body language. This is simple, but it's powerful. Don't have your arms crossed. Make good eye contact, but not so much eye contact that you're staring at the guy. Give them freedom to look around. Sometimes when they're talking, they're starting to go inside. They want to look around. Give them that freedom. Consider matching their posture. If they're laid back in a chair, you might want to lay back a little bit. If they're intense, you want to kind of get with them on that. Touch, acknowledge. Give a hug with meaning. Practice effective body language. Rachel's now going to share some of her insights as a professional counselor.
So, in the professional realm, the term that we use for best listening practices is called empathy. And I think that's probably a term that most of us have heard before, but I've found out that we don't really know the depth of it. We don't really know what it means. My favorite definition of empathy says accurate empathic understanding. There it is. Accurate empathic understanding is the ability to deeply grasp the subject world of another person. And it's a lot deeper than just listening, as Tim referenced. It involves effort. It involves making the effort to understand somebody's life and somebody's experiences. And empathy involves a lot of love and a lot of interest into going into the deeper places of someone's heart, in the deeper places of someone's life, someone's narrative. Sometimes we get empathy and sympathy confused with each other. I don't know if you guys do the same thing. This comes up a lot in the classes that I teach to the criminal population, a lack of understanding of what empathy is. And an easy way that I use to differentiate empathy and sympathy is sympathy is feeling for someone, empathy is feeling with someone. There's a certain distance with sympathy, distance between you and the other person. With empathy, you're getting in the trenches with someone emotionally. My mom uses this phrase, there comes a time when you just have to get your hands in the meatloaf. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever made meatloaf or meatballs or something. You can only stir it with a spoon for so long, right? Before you have to ditch the spoon and get your hands in. And that's kind of what it is, what it's like working with people. You can only have the surface conversations for so long before you kind of have to start digging more deeply into these things. So let's say back up a little bit. One of the most important things that I found in empathy is to recognize the difference between someone's content and their affect. Someone's content is basically what they're saying to you. The story they're telling you, the narrative they're telling you, the facts, the information, that's the content. The affect is the emotion. So emotion that they're expressing, could be emotion they're not even expressing to you. But we have to be able to tell the difference. So let's say I'm talking to somebody, I'm talking to a guy about how things are going at work, and he says, I think things are going fine. I know God's in control. So what? He's like not looking at me. He seems kind of tense. He seems a little off. His content is telling me one thing, and his affect is telling me something completely different, right? And this is something that we experience a lot. His content is telling me, I trust God, I know the Bible, I think things are going to be just fine. His affect is telling me, I don't think things are going to be fine, I'm hopeless, I'm really discouraged right now. So I think it's really, really important to understand the two different elements and to, like Tim was saying, look for clues, that this is kind of a search for clues. We can really miss what's going on in someone's experiences when we don't look at their affect. This is especially common with Christians, and especially common with the Christians I work with doing one-on-one counseling. Because for the most part, we know what the Bible says, right? We are educated enough becoming Christians. So when we're processing our experiences, our emotions, our thoughts, everything is being filtered through, this is what I'm supposed to think, this is what I'm supposed to say, this is what Jesus wants me to do, this is what God thinks of me. So everything that we're thinking is being filtered through that. So that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you have to kind of dig more deeply under that to see what someone's actual emotions are. So some of the biggest things that get in the way of empathy are ourselves, our own thought processes. I don't know, many of you probably have heard of cognitive distortions, and the ones I'm getting are from the Feeling Good Handbook from David Burns. There's more that people have added, but I'm going to quickly go through 4 of them. And cognitive distortions are essentially unhealthy ways of thinking, unhealthy patterns of thinking. The first one I wanted to look at is jumping to conclusions, which sounds pretty self-explanatory, right? It's a way that we assume things about people. We assume what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and especially we assume what they're intending. It makes a lot of sense to us to do that. So specifically mind reading, and most of us would say, oh, I don't try and read people's minds. Yes, you do. Like, this is a normal thing that you do. And this is a normal thing that I do when I'm talking to people. And it's basically making assumptions. You know, we've heard that term many times before. It's inferring or guessing what someone is feeling, what someone's thinking, without asking them. That's an important part of it, without asking them. It can really harm your relationships with people, and it can really harm how you listen. Secondly, I wanted to look at labeling and mislabeling is a sub-part of that. Nobody likes to be labeled. This is especially common in my criminal population because they are labeled, and they take offense to it, and it affects their life. This is something that you can do in your mind. You can label people in your mind. Maybe you're not verbalizing it, but it's going on. So it's kind of like mind reading, making assumptions. It's a bit of a mental jump that we make, and it makes life make sense to us. So it's a very natural thing to do because we want to understand the people. This is not a way that is not a method that's going to help us get closer to somebody when we label them. We want to be able to, I know what kind of person they are, I know how to categorize them, therefore I know how to fix them. That's not necessarily the case. The next one I want to look at is filtering. This is super common for us personally. This is something that we do probably about our own lives. People give us a compliment, we're like, I just heard, that I'm a late person from what you said, not that I'm like a super efficient, diligent person. We filter out the good things, and what we come away with is the negative. And this is a way that we can look at other people as well. So someone's talking to me, and I'm only seeing the negative things that they're saying, which is notable because that's probably why they're talking to me. But it's important to know that when you only see the negative in somebody and you're only seeing someone's sin, it's really going to harm your relationship with them. And it's really going to harm the way you listen to them and the way you eventually respond to them. This is not how Jesus listened to people. Jesus did not listen with the filter mindset. My encouragement would be to, in your mind, bring up people's strengths and the victories that they've had. You don't even have to talk about it yet, just think about it. And see how that changes the way that you view them. See how that changes the way that you respond to them. Because it's the way that God sees them. And that will completely change the trajectory of how you see them and how you help them. The final one is should statements. So this is a little bit of a different direction. The definition as it's written is expecting others to do what they morally should or ought to do irrespective of their situation. And as Christians, we are certainly given spiritual imperatives in the Bible. That's true. But what I really want to stress here is to avoid blanket rules or shoulds when you're listening to people and then when you're eventually answering them. Every situation is different. Every person is different. And we need to respect that. Don't reduce it to shoulds. Very quickly, we're like, well, you should read your Bible more, and you should be a more faithful person, and you should do this, and you should do this. And those things are important, but I would say just hold back on that for a little bit in your own mind. Because shoulds, from a counseling perspective, shoulds don't really reach the motivation of why you're doing something. So it doesn't go as deeply as you would like it to. So in conclusion to this section, these cognitive distortions kind of tell us that the overarching point is that we need to just truly pay attention to the heart of the matter and really listen to what people are saying. The essence of listening is to really pay attention to the heart. And Satan wants us to make the conversation about shoulds, about negatives, about labels, but God wants it to be driven by love and by valuing grace and truth.
Wow, that is some good stuff. Woo! I love that, man. I love the meatloaf thing, affect and content, really paying attention, all those distortions that go on inside our minds. Remember, there's two hearts on display, right? So Jesus was an amazing listener. And the good news, it can change for us immediately. This is something all of us can leave the room today and go, I'm going to be a better listener. Maybe I won't be a counselor like Rachel is. She's pretty awesome. But I can definitely be a better listener. But Jesus does something even more amazing than that. He connects his listening skills to asking astonishing questions. And I want to go through some questions Jesus did, okay? This is where the rubber meets the road a lot of times. Jesus questions. Here's why we do questions. They're so important. Number one, questions create open dialogue. You know, there's no conversation going on if you're sitting there going, I know what I want to say, I know what I want to say, I know what I want to say. That means there's no dialogue. Questions help you to have open dialogue. Secondly, questions help people to verbalize a response. It puts the responsibility back where it belongs. Questions lead to more positive, long-term, and sustainable results. You can tell people what they should do, and maybe you'll get some results. But if you use questionings, you're going to plumb their hearts. And you're going to get them to start verbalizing what's going on inside their own hearts and mind. And that's a lot more of a sustainable approach to change. Questions allow us to pause for a little bit and perhaps even look to God instead of to this conversation. I've said this before, questions examine our hearts and our attitudes and our motives. They reveal the hearts of both people in the room. And finally, questions take thoughtfulness instead of kind of off-the-cuff comments. So it's okay to stop and think. A lot of times in my counseling, I just say, hold on a second, and I'll stop for 20, 30 seconds, and I'm thinking. It's a little awkward sometimes. The person's looking at me like, I thought you were my counselor. You're supposed to say something. I will, hold on. And I'm thinking about another question. And what's it do for them? It helps them to go inside a little bit and start thinking about, what am I doing in this office? Where are we heading here? So I want you to go home and think about those this week. But let's look at some questions Jesus asked. Number one, Jesus asked what I call solution-focused questions. You remember the time they're getting ready to feed 5,000? And Jesus goes, hey guys, feed everybody, would you? And I think it's Andrew walked up, he goes, how are we going to do that? Jesus asked an impossible question. And then Andrew goes, wait a minute, there's this little boy with some fish and some loaves of bread. That was called a solution-focused question. They wanted to start looking at the solutions that were going to happen. Jesus looked at what are the available resources. Jesus probably knew there was a little boy there with some bread and fish, and Jesus knew what he could do. So solution-focused questions, they look at different resources that are going on. You know, a solution-focused question doesn't focus on the problem. We already know what the problem is. Rachel just said, you're sitting here talking to me. Solution focus is looking at how we're going to solve this thing. You know, there's a story about a Japanese farmer. He's a rice farmer. And his fields are up on this big hill. And he's farming his rice, and he looks out over the ocean, and there's a tsunami coming at his town. He's got a little village about a mile down below. And he sees this tsunami coming in. It's going to kill everybody. He doesn't have time to run down to warn the town. No telephones. What's he do? Turns around, he lights his field on fire. Everybody in the village goes, look, the field's on fire, let's run up there. Problem solved. The solution to problems is not necessarily tied to how we got the problem. Matter of fact, many times it's not even associated with it. Think in terms of what are the solutions. We have a thing called the miracle question. I'll just ask the person. Let's say you go home tonight and you go to bed and something happens in the middle of the night and your problem is solved by a miracle. Can you tell me how that happened? They say, yeah, it's a miracle. Then I say, well, tell me how it happened. They start telling me their solutions. And I sit there like, yep, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. They're telling me how they're going to solve that thing. We focus on solutions here. Secondly, Jesus had what he calls considering questions. Remember the woman at the well? Remember Jesus wasn't supposed to talk to her, right? She's a woman, she's a Samaritan, he's a Jew. He wasn't supposed to be talking to her. But what's he do? He goes, hey, would you give me a drink? That was a loaded question. It was a considering question. Considering questions are the kind of questions that break down barriers. Jesus knew that conversation was going to get him in trouble. You know, a considering question is asking the other person what their values are. Sometimes I'll ask my students at school who aren't studying very much. I'll say, hey, it's my mom's fault, it's my dad's fault. So I'll just say, hey, what would happen if your mom and dad left for a whole year? What would you do? Wow. I make people stop and think and consider how things might be different. You know, considering questions, they give people pause and reflection. There's a guy that I studied the Bible with years ago, Dr. Taylor. And we were getting ready to baptize him. He's a very successful physician. And he was going on and on about how much he loved being a doctor and helping other people. So I stopped him for a second. I said, Jim, what would happen if you were going to be a doctor and you could only practice in a third world country where everybody's poor and you're going to be poor? And he stopped and he just started crying. And I didn't think about this being a considering question, but he stopped. He thought, wow, you're hitting my values, Tim. And he had to stop and consider, why am I a real doctor anyways? What am I doing this for? So considering questions. Number 3, obvious questions. Obvious questions. Remember the woman that was getting ready to be stoned to death? Remember that one? Yeah. And Jesus told the guys, hey, whichever you guys have never sinned, go ahead and throw a rock. And what'd they all do? They what? They all turned around and walked away. Jesus saw them walk away. The woman saw them walk away. But what did Jesus ask her? He said, woman, where are they? He knew where they were, right? He asked what's called an obvious question. He asked a question that led to convictions. Sometimes we ask questions that lead to convictions. We're not looking for the right answer. We're asking the question to enforce what's going on. Number 4, we call them information-seeking questions. Remember the guy who was an invalid for 38 years? Remember that one? He's pretty famous. He'd been going up and down by the water, never went in, probably had a reputation. And what's Jesus asked the guy? You want to get well? You know, this guy had been like this for a long time. One thing Jesus wanted to do, he wanted to make sure he understood the man's motives. He was respectful toward people. He asked him, do you want to get well? If the guy said, no, I really don't, my guess is Jesus wouldn't have healed him. Jesus was respectful. He asked questions. You know, sometimes with people, I'll just ask questions like, what else? Can you tell me more about your situation? Can you help me understand how you grew up? Tell me about your dad. Tell me about your brothers and sisters. Can you tell me about a really tragic time of your life? I want to understand people. Fifthly, Jesus asked what we call grace event questions. These are pretty cool. Remember at the very end of John? So Jesus had already died, had been resurrected. And what were the guys out doing? They're out fishing, right? So Jesus walks up to the shore. What's he say? Hey guys, have you got any fish yet? He already knew, right? They were lousy fishermen. Jesus remembered, and more importantly, Peter remembered Luke chapter 5. Remember Luke 5? When he said, hey, why don't you throw the nets on the other side? And they caught so much fish they couldn't haul them all in. When Jesus said, hey, you guys got any fish yet? He was pointing to a grace event in their life. And that's why Peter couldn't even put his clothes back on. He jumped into the water half naked to get to the shore. Because Peter remembered, oh my gosh, it's the Lord again. He remembered, oh, that time we caught all those fish back in Luke 5. He didn't think that. He thought, But Jesus would ask a question that got people to remember the grace in their life. The other time he did it with Peter, by the way, was they started cooking the fish, right? A little fire. And the Bible uses the word for charcoal fire. It's only used one other time in the Bible. It's when Peter was warming his hands at the denial. Jesus would call people back to previous events in their lives that were full of grace. Because it filled their hearts with like, oh yeah, the Lord is good. So we ask people at our ministry, tell us about your conversion. What was it like? What flipped for you? I ask people, tell me about the last time you felt innocent in your life. What was that like? That's a grace event. We want people to recall when Jesus was good to them. Those are called grace memories. And then finally, we have Jesus asking vision-seeking questions. Right after this, he looked at Peter. He goes, hey, Peter, do you love me more than all the other guys? Peter's like, God, Jesus, I love you. Then he goes, oh, good, go feed my sheep. Sometimes Jesus would ask questions to get people thinking in terms of their vision for the future. So instead of asking a question that's accusatory like, do you really love God? Do you really want to be a Christian? Instead of asking accusatory questions, ask the same question like, how can I help you love God in a greater way this week? How can I walk with you and help you be a better disciple? Kind of like Rachel just mentioned. Ask questions that look to the future for people. If you could do anything for God in the rest of your life, what would you do? I like this one here. I say, when you get really old, what do you want to be known for? I get people talking about that. And then we just work backwards. Okay, if that's where you want to be at 85, here we are at 40. What's that going to look like now? So those are Jesus' questions. Rachel's going to come up now and share some great insights about questions.
So I'd like to focus on some of the underlying principles of when you're helping someone understanding yourself and the other person a little bit better. We're shifting gears a little bit with this one. Oftentimes, I know, as a Christian, we as Christians operate under the assumption that we are the ones chiefly responsible for the person in front of us to grow and to change, right? I'm pretty sure this is something that is a common occurrence with most of us, but that's not the truth. It's not the case. The person in front of you has the impetus to change, 100%. The Spirit gets to change that person if they seek after it. It's up to them if they're going to seek God's strength and the Spirit's ability to help them change. It is not up to you. And I think that's something that we get tripped up on a whole lot. There's a difference between being responsible to someone and being responsible for someone. I know this is something that we've heard before, most of us, but let me break it down a little bit. So being responsible to someone, you can be responsible to love someone, to guide them, to rejoice with them, to listen to them, to question them, to mourn with them. You're not responsible for them. You're not responsible for their decisions, for their relationship with God, for their mistakes, for their salvation, and especially you're not responsible for their sin. And that's a very hard concept, I think, for us to truly understand. So I can encourage you to have your quiet time. I can talk to you about God. I can go on a prayer walk with you. I can buy you a book. But I can't make you have a relationship with God. That's true. It's up to you whether or not you're going to have a relationship with God. And if you don't, it's not my fault. And that's not in a way of like, it's not my fault, but you need to understand the division of responsibility. And I don't know if some of you guys have been around for a long time. There's this song, if I don't get to heaven, it's going to be nobody's fault but mine. I don't remember that one. Yeah, real heavy-handed, right? Like, there's a reason we don't sing it anymore. But the truth is still the same, right? If I don't read my Bible, if I don't get to heaven, if I don't share my faith, it's nobody's fault but mine. It's true. And that's true about the person in front of you. If you do whatever you can and they're not going to do what you're directing them towards, it's up to them. That's their decision. There's this concept that I love about locus of control. And a person's locus, it comes from the Latin word that means place or location. External locus of control means a person believes that their decisions in life are controlled by environmental factors which they cannot influence. Internal locus of control says the person believes they have control in their life. And you can see the difference between the two, right? The person with external locus of control kind of acts like a victim, has a victim mentality, and there's a continuum. I don't think anyone is completely on one side or completely on the other, but the person can kind of act like a victim, really get kind of bogged down in like, oh, it's God's fault, it's my ministry's fault, it's my boss's fault. This is something that Jesus dealt with. So referencing, John 5:7 with the invalid, Jesus said, do you want to get well? And he said, I don't have anyone to help me in the pool. Whenever I try and get in, somebody gets in ahead of me. And Jesus is like, no, what do you want? So Jesus always brought people back to personal responsibility. And you can see that the invalid, his first reaction was, oh, this person doesn't do this for me. And this person won't help me in this way. And we hear this a lot. And to be honest, we also do this a lot. Like, people didn't love me enough. The ministry wasn't welcoming enough to me. This person wasn't in my life enough. It's not other people's fault. And that's something that Jesus saw, and he gently redirected people to personal responsibility. And when he did it with the invalid, it really helped him to see, yeah, I do want to get well. So I had this client, really not the best outcome with a client relationship, but I saw him for 6 months. The very last session, we were terminating, as it's called, and he came in and said, I'm no better off than I was when I first came in to see you. Nothing has changed. My life even seems like it's worse. And my feelings were kind of hurt, obviously, but I listened and I said, what did you do about the tools that you were given? Did you do your homework? Because it's called homework. Did you do the things outside of session that we talked about? Did you back this stuff up? The things that you want to change, did you do it? Outside of session, he got really quiet and he was like, no, I didn't. And ended the session with the personal responsibility. This is something that I think we deal with a lot, unfortunately, in our own lives and in other people's lives. One of the best things I've ever learned, other than the gospel of Jesus Christ, is I was in therapy when I was 18, and I went and I had a horrible talk with my grandparents, and I came in and I said, my grandparents make me feel so guilty. Anyone ever said that before? Somebody makes me feel so guilty, or something. And my therapist, old guy, nice gray hair, he said, you know what, Rachel? No one can make you feel anything. And I was like, shut up. I was not feeling that. But then once I thought about it, I thought, he's right. No one can make me feel anything. And this has got to be one of the most freeing things I've ever learned in my life. We have events happen to us. People who are helping have events happen to them. But we get to decide what we think and what we believe and ultimately what we feel. Now, this is an oversimplification. This is not the God's honest truth that we can just like magically change our feelings. Like, I'm not trying to say that, but I think some feelings are a lot more natural than others after certain situations. But the point is that we have a say in what we think and what we believe. And when we affect what we think and what we believe, it changes what we feel. And I truly believe that if this is something that you can work to put wrap your mind around, it'll affect change in your own life, and it'll truly help the people who you're listening to, and it'll help you in your own life.
That was great. Dog. I love sitting at the feet of learned people and getting those nuggets. You know, today I just want to conclude, Jesus had a profound effect on people that he interacted with in a short amount of time. His listening skills and his ability to ask questions led his friends to make dramatic changes in their hearts, in their thinking, and in their behavior. We too can listen and ask questions just like Jesus and have a similar impact. It takes patience, practice, and perception. Pray during your conversations. Listen intently with all your heart and consider asking a question that will move the conversation further down the road toward a solution. Read about Jesus' astonishing interactions with those he met and changed, how he listened with all of his heart, and how he asked astonishing questions that created amazing change. Imitate him. Think like he thinks. Challenge yourself to be like him as he changed the entire course of human history and the hearts of people like you and I. Jesus lives today and changes people today just like he did 2,000 years ago. And the astonishing thing is, he uses people like you and I to do the same thing. Let me close out with something Jesus said that rattles around my heart all the time. Jesus said, I am among you, I'm in your midst, as one who serves. Serve like Jesus by listening and questioning and thus understanding. And I want to close out today with just a minute to let you know about a couple things. Over by the book table, there's some other tables, and one of our sisters, Crescenda Jones, has got a really nice book out there. All right? And I'm going to confess, I grabbed one last night when she was gone, and I started going through it. I'm like, I like this stuff. So I want you to go by her table and talk to her. And then right next to that table is the In Motion table. And if you think an In Motion ministry, which is a church-based ministry that many people in your church could lead, if you think that's something that your church might be interested, please come by and talk to me. I'll give you some information. You can take it back to your ministry leaders and give me a call. Maybe we get something going with that. All right? So thank you so much for listening.